The first question, what role do peer workers play? Don't know whether you have a volunteer from the panel. Frank?
At the moment, peer workers are not described very much at all in any of the major policy initiatives or adventures, which I think is a real problem. I've been lucky enough to encounter Gary Parker and some of the work coming out of Kansas that seems to be generating some pretty solid evidence that peer workers in the right place and with the right training and approach can have a really positive impact on the overall system. You know, they have good data around reduced arrests and reduced violence and reduced hospitalisations and all those things that we would expect governments to be very interested in. But I think we're in the early days, and I think a bit like David's advice to us in his presentation, I think we need to hear those stories told and told well, because I would have thought that peer workers will have an important role to play in both the NDIS and the other programs that gather around it. But we'll need to be watchful that that's not considered to be just a cheap workforce and a cheap sort of substitute for a professional workforce, to use the sort of classic discriminatory term. And I think that's where we need to focus some of our attention, is to really be clear about what it is that we think peer workers can and should and could do, to gather that evidence to support that case and to support the development of a peer workforce, which I think is an important opportunity. We know we're going to be workforce challenged into the future. Why would we close off such a fertile avenue of opportunity?
I talked before about being on an NDIS working group a couple of years ago, and the only time I ever had their attention was when I talked about peer work. It was very interesting. Most of the time they weren't very interested in what I had to say about how this would play in the area of mental health and mental illness. But this notion that we were starting to change the definitions around who's the expert was really fascinating and challenging for all the other disability groups at the table. The sort of developments that have taken place, particularly in NGOs and to a limited extent in some clinical services, really do change the issues around them and us to some degree. I visit quite often FAMS teams where they've got to the stage where the majority of their workers are people who are managing their own mental illness. There's a lot of people who are still very uncomfortable about that idea, but progress is happening quietly, and in some places it's happening in a revolutionary way. I hear HR people in the NGO mental health space saying that if two people have got equal skills in the ways that we need for this job, we'll give the job to the one with the lived experience. That's a really interesting place to have got to, and I don't think we are telling the world enough about it yet.
Could I just add that I think that underscores a point that we don't often give credit to and celebrate enough in this transition to the NDIS, is just how much the mental health space has to offer, how much insight the mental health space has to offer. I think as much as we'd say the place of consumers and carers is not adequately recognised in mental health, I think it's also true to say that it's miles ahead of a lot of other areas of disability. And I think that we need to be selling some of those ideas during this time of reform, because I think mental health is criticised unfairly in comparison to a lot of those other areas of work.
It's an interesting question of the whole area of peer work and peer workforce. I think we've hastened very quickly in this area, despite other people probably thinking that we haven't gone very far. But the challenge, I think, is that do we understand what... Just grab the mic. There, yeah. Peer workforce, I think, is a provocative challenge for our workforce. This is not about just simply adding someone who's had an experience of mental illness into our existing workforce. This asks us to think really differently about what is it that a peer workforce brings that cannot be replicated by other professional groups. And we've not done that argument well in this country, nor in any other country in the world. We've still ascribed that a peer is someone who has an experience of an illness, full stop. A peer, in my view, is someone that can utilise their knowledge and their experiences of overcoming to join with someone else in their overcoming. That's the part that we actually have to get stronger at, that there's actually something to add that no other part of the multidisciplinary team has is their niche. The challenge here is how to support it and how to grow it as a valued contribution to our mental health sector. And I think that we may have fallen into the trap of just plonking people who've identified with a mental illness into workplaces that aren't ready to change their ways of working.
I guess I would add to that two things really. Firstly, that this kind of dash that we have to find the solution then becomes the peer support worker without us really thinking through what should that look like, how will that play out, how will we support the development of these roles, and being really thoughtful about that rather than doing what I think we've done in the UK, which is work on the assumption that we're all talking about the same thing when we're talking about peer support workers. So there are organisations in the UK set up to help people develop peer support workers, but actually it would be much more useful if those organisations instead had different conversations with organisations about what it is they're trying to achieve. So I think we must be careful not to assume we're all talking about the same thing and that we haven't got to the end point of the solution before we've had those really important conversations about what actually are we trying to do here. And I can't remember what the second thing was.
I think there's some other... when we talk about evidence-based, I think it's really strong that the evidence base suggests that peer support is very valuable and almost into that hierarchy of evidence. But it's not paid peer support that they're talking about in that evidence. They're talking about peer-to-peer connection. And as we get into more paid professional roles in peer support, the evidence for the difference that it makes in people's lives is smaller. And so the risk is, how do we support peer knowledges and peer pedagogy and peer ways of working in a workforce without risking peers just becoming another clinical worker or another worker? And I think that's the risk, that we've got to hold that tension and protect the integrity of peer work well. There will be a power base as soon as you bring it into a professional space that will lose its peerness, if that makes sense. So I'm passionate about peer, but let's get it right, not quick.
Another question. Taking a different track, what role does spirituality play in recovery?
This is really interesting. If we go back to some evidence, I was fortunate to be on a research team in Australia that's done the largest qualitative research around recovery from schizophrenia. It still remains one of the largest in the world, this study. And one of the questions that we asked from a constructivist point of view was to ask, could you tell us about your journey of recovery? Back then we used the R word, now I'm a little bit more reticent about using the R word. And there's 1,001 pages of transcript in this study. And every sentence was thematically analysed. 49% of people, without being prompted, talked about their spirituality as an important aspect to their recovery. And we thought that would have been higher, much higher. But then we started to think about, well, why? Why wasn't that as high as what we thought? Because when you hear anecdotally, people talk about their spirituality being an important part, yet the research wasn't coming out with that. And I think there was a number of reasons, is that A, it was done in Queensland. Well, majority of people participate in Queensland. But secondly, I think there's a part when you don't ask about spirituality directly, people don't say. It's not like you meet a researcher for the first time and say, hey, let me tell you about my spirituality. It's not something that's a cultural norm in this country. This research was replicated in the States and in Italy, and it was around 90% percentile of people who talked about spirituality being a really important part of their process. And that was a question also that wasn't prompted. It was just, can you tell us about your recovery journey? I think what we mean by spirituality means different for different people, but what it's starting to suggest is it's a strong anchor, it's a strong centrepiece, it's an internal kind of plank that people make sense and meaning about in a whole lot of different ways. What we understood as a research team is that in Australia, when we talk about spirituality, we akin it to an organised religion as opposed to an internal shift, where the Americans and the Italians were much more about an internal idea of spirituality. I think the other thing is that we've learned when we participate in services on the receiving end, to speak about spirituality can get a diagnosis. So when a researcher starts to ask you or inquire into that area, it's kind of like, don't go there. So it's not something that's on the table to discuss. It's something that we have to do in private, maybe with peers, but it doesn't come into using it in any therapeutic way. That's just my humble thoughts. But I think it's great potential that we need to start inviting and thinking about how do people, what do they draw upon in those difficult times, and how do they make sense of their spirituality as an invitation for a different conversation out of symptoms and diagnosis.
I think I'd just add that if we learn one thing from our failure to adequately embrace Indigenous issues, it's that a failure to embrace the notion of spirituality in a culturally appropriate and sensitive way is a terminal failing in any service offering that we might have. And so why would we expect it to be different in non-Indigenous communities?
I know one of the practitioners that I know about. Hello? Testing 7, 8, 9. One of the practitioners that I know always asks people, from where do you draw your strength? And that almost always elicits the response that people draw on, give a spiritual response to that question, from where do you draw your strength? Anne?
Yeah, I would just add, I agree entirely, and I think we need to pay attention to how we enable the professionals to have those conversations, because there's a real danger here, isn't there, that we go for the technical fix. We write a policy that says you must make sure that you ask about spirituality, and professionals, in my experience, certainly in the UK, we have we're very similar in terms of it's a place we don't comfortably go with people. So how do we engage with practitioners to make them feel comfortable to have those conversations? How do we engage with questions that don't feel uncomfortable and don't feel kind of voyeuristic? Because I think that's some of the fear. So how do we enable the workforce to engage in these conversations without simply saying, yes, in every care plan, spiritual, which I think is how we've done it in the UK. I don't know about you guys, but there is always a spirituality box, and you can almost feel the practitioners kind of going, tick. Yeah, it's along with the sex box, because people don't have those conversations either. I can't believe that I just said sex on a panel. I can't believe that.
Oh, you're so English.
Next question, which I think probably could start with you, David. What happens when you don't fit the NDIA or other services criteria, yet you need mental health help?
Well, you've all got a rough idea of what happens now, and the sort of gaps that there are, but also the sort of strengths that there are. Look, I think what I was trying to say before is that whatever that future is, we've got to help make it, because at the moment there are some very large risks that we will in fact be going backwards. You know, we come of a generation where most of the time we believe in the inevitability of progress, and it's never inevitable. And in fact, many of the gains we've made in mental health, in our understanding of a more holistic approach to helping people deal with mental health issues, has the potential to be significantly undermined right at the moment by a whole perfect storm of factors. I can see a sort of user pays and a resplitting into disability versus clinical and fiscal crises and all sorts of things, posing huge risks at the moment. We have got to be good at describing the progress we've made over the last 15 years or so. You know, I despair when I hear there are still, you know, some of those dinosaurs who want to reopen the institutions, given half a chance. But it's easy to dismiss them. But I was at a dinner party the other night with a bunch of people I get on pretty well with, and we were talking about the federal government's rejection of the idea of gradually shifting some more resources from hospital to community and mental health that was in the latest National Mental Health Commission review. And every other person at the dinner table, except my partner, thank God, said, well, she's right. You can't shift resources. You can't rob Peter to pay Paul. It's just not going to work. We did too much of that 20 years ago, deinstitutionalisation. So I think, God, you know, we think we know what's going on. We think we know that the progress we're all making is inevitable and is well known about. It isn't. It simply isn't. We've got a lot of work to do over the next 2 or 3 years to resist the forces that will shrink these services that are currently available.
I think there are a series of statements or questions here which probably follow on from that. One is, why are we still talking and nothing is really changing? A second one is, 25 years after Burdekin report, question mark. And the third one is, do we use inquiries to slow down or stop the system so we don't have to make changes? Would you like to have a go, Frank? That one?
Sure. I'd give 2 answers. The first answer is to say that, as I think I said yesterday in the answer to a question, we're in a very different situation now to where we were when Burdekin wrote his report. It's not by any means resolved, it's not satisfactory, it's not where we want it to be, but it's better. And it's better because of a whole lot of combined efforts. And I think we can easily lose track of that and be a bit disheartened by a lack of progress. And sometimes I do think we actually need to just pause and reflect a little bit on the progress that has been made. But then I would say importantly that we need to use that little bit of optimism that we'll gain from that reflective process to just revitalise our efforts to achieve reform. Inquiries are definitely used by governments to slow the progress of reform. That's one of the things they can do. But inquiries also, you know, gather evidence that can then be used against government. So we have evidence on the table now, the National Mental Health Commission's report and others, that we can now go to government and say, well, you asked for it, you got it, you know, what are you going to do about it now? And I think one of the big challenges that we have, I think, is to keep our advocacy efforts energised and engaged and coordinated and unified in a way that means when we do go to government to put pressure on them, we don't go with 100 messages that are contradictory, but we go with a few small messages that we're united about. And I think that's the governments that change because there's something simple that they can do to progress things. And I think they're the sorts of answers that we need to develop and put before government, and put before government as a unified, broad collaboration of consumers, carers, providers, interested third parties and others.
I think this is a moment to do exactly what Frank's talking about right now with these bilateral discussions going on about the NDIS and with other bilateral discussions going on about mental health funding. it really is time to say to whoever you can say it to, bureaucrats and politicians, act now and get on with implementing that National Mental Health Commission framework. It is not perfect. Those of you who've read the 700 pages, put your hand up, there won't be many. Right. You know, this is a moment in time to say, just for God's sake, accept this as roughly the right framework for the next 10 years. We can argue about the details as we go along. You know, again and again and again we go through this process. Well, this one, we waited for nearly a year and a half for the work to be done because the government told us to wait, and when it came out, this is when we'd know where to go from here on in. Just say, across parties preferably, get on with implementing that report.
Could I just add a reflection as well, that I think we sometimes mistake media attention for influence in government. I want to just draw out a couple of ideas here. We've recently had, I think, the rather incredible sort of personal story of Australian of the Year, Rosie Batty, in the news. Blanket sort of news coverage brought tremendous attention to the issues of domestic violence that we've been, you know, many aware of and concerned about for a long time, but considerably underdone. But in the face of that, by any reading at the moment, there's not been very much concrete government response other than to withdraw funding from community legal centres across the country. And I think that tells us something. So it tells us that an unarguably sympathetic story around domestic violence that with blanket media coverage is not necessarily enough to get you over the line. It might, but it might not. And the other story is a review of collaborative research centres. I'm not sure how many hundreds of millions of dollars the government invests into collaborative research centres, but they had a report into collaborative research centres recently. How many people were aware of that report was undertaken? 1? 2? I didn't see much about it in the media, and the day the report was tabled, the government accepted all of its recommendations and agreed to progress it. So I'm saying that because I think there are many, many more opportunities to influence government than you can quickly give credit for. The letter that you write to your local member or to your federal member is likely to have more impact than the story that Mental Health Australia gets up in the news next week. They both help, but the power of that sort of personal and direct influence, going along to your local member, telling them about the programs and services in your area that are affected by the decisions that are being made at the moment, telling them the stories of hope and recovery that have been achieved in various ways because they've invested resources or supported resources into the community, is remarkably powerful. And I don't think we should lose sight of the fact that that grassroots movement is tremendously important. There's certainly the theatre of federal politics requires that, you know, from time to time there are stories in the media and there's speeches and there's, you know, all sorts of things. But I think more and more actually politicians are quite cynical and uninfluenced by that sort of noise in the media, and that a much more sophisticated game can be played around saying, okay, well, you're here talking to your local member about mental health issues the same day that I happen to be in the federal parliament talking to a few members about the national issues, or David's fellowship parliamentary friends meeting, you know, is talking about the same sorts of issues. I think the momentum that's gained by those sorts of conversations is really important and shouldn't be underdone.
At the risk of being shot down in flames here, Burdekin was a pivotal moment. It was the first time, at that time when it was released, I was in services and I read both volumes of the Burdekin report and realised that the personal experience that I was having was shared by many, many people in this country, that it wasn't a sole experience. I want to challenge us. Has that experience fundamentally shifted for people in the last 30 years? Because we may have paint on the walls, and we may have more community services, and we may have kind of a more palatable service. But have we dared to provide different responses that don't entrap people in service life as the end result? And my answer at the moment is actually I think I got better services 30 years ago than what people get today.
You probably ought to try the next one as well then, for your misbehaviour of that answer. Why is it so hard for people to treat others as they would like to be treated, Helen?
How long have we got? There's a friend of Anne's and mine, Professor Alain Tapor, in Sweden, and he has a love for Trieste. Do people know about Trieste in Italy? Yes. Trieste is on the Adriatic Sea. It's also known as the home of community mental health. It was the one that Franco Basaglia, a psychiatrist, dared to be different and dared to stretch and dared to say, how can we as the community of Trieste support people who live in our community not to live in an institution? And if you go to Trieste, the old hospital is on the hill, and it kind of is a shadow across the town. And Trieste, like every other place in Italy, used to be, you could live out your days. It had a cemetery there. And Franco Basaglia led the Italian government around Law 180, which meant it was passed that said no one could be detained in a psychiatric hospital after Law 180 was passed. Anyhow, so the hospital grounds still remain, and they're occupied by high-end apartments and cafes and stuff like that. But there's a part of the hospital that is in ruins, and it's kept there for a memory of the journey of what has come from too. And I was walking through this with Alain one day, and I could feel the pain. I could feel almost the screams of people. And I had tears in my eyes, and I said, how can man do this to man? How can we treat people as objects? How do we lose sight of our humanness? And he looked at me and he said, I think, therefore I am. And I go, huh? You're going to have to break that down for me. He said, Descartes, the philosopher. He said, it's Descartes, the philosopher. He said, I think, therefore I am. And he said, if I don't think you are the same as me, if I don't think you're rational, if I don't think you can contribute, if I don't think you have the same intellect that I do, then I can do to you. And he said, this is the fundamental root of power, and it's the fundamental root of stigma and discrimination. And until we actually come to our sameness and our humanness, that we actually see each other through that, we will always be at the risk of treating people, modifying them, fixing them at the cost of their life. And I think at that day I got why, as human beings, we struggle to see each other as the same. And that's the...
Thanks, Helen. Anne, would you like to add?
Just to reinforce that, really, that there is this process that's been well researched, and it's called othering. So we other the person. And we do that for all sorts of reasons of self-protection. But actually, that's part of what I was talking about yesterday in terms of, as practitioners, we need to stand into that space and really ask ourselves those questions. And in the UK, we're trying to address some of this, but throwing technical fixes at it that, like you wouldn't believe. So one of the things that we're doing in the UK, which is we're supposed to do what's called the friends and family test. So every time, have I got any friends and family? Not anymore. So the idea is you ask people who use services, but also staff, to say whether you would recommend this service to a family member or a friend. But for me, that question really only ever gets to here. I can think myself through, I think, therefore I am. I can think myself into a situation where I think, I would do that. Yeah, that's no problem. But actually, would I want this service for somebody I loved? Is a different question. It's not about filling in a form and ticking a box. It's, can I actually be in this connection with you as a real person? I remember when I went to Trieste, we've all been there, we've all been Trieste'd.
It's on the mental health too.
Yeah, it is, yeah. And Roberto was showing me around, Mezzina, who is the clinical director. And it's a community service, and it's open to everyone, and it challenges all sorts of our kind of thinking about, the doors are always open and anybody can access. And psychiatrists from the UK go, you can't do that. You'll be overwhelmed. And he says, no, we're not. We're just, the doors are open. People use us as they need to, but they don't feel they have to. So anyway, sorry, I'm digressing now. So he was showing me around, and there's like different areas in this community centre, and there are something like 4 bedrooms. Yeah. And they're not. In the UK, our funding is based on a kind of counterintuitive. You only get the money if there are people in the service, rather than you only get the money if people are in the centre of their own lives. And these beds aren't funded in that way. These bedrooms, they are they are there if people need them, but if people don't need them, it's okay for them to be empty, that's another challenge there, right there. And Roberto was showing me around. He said, I will show you in the bedroom, but I can't show you right now because there's a member of staff who is struggling at the moment and needs some support. So at the moment, she's shifted from being a member of staff to being somebody who's receiving a service. And at that time, the policy in the UK was that if you were a member of staff and you needed to receive a service, you would generally go somewhere else. You wouldn't receive a service in your local service. And I thought, wow. And he said, because actually we know her, we love her, we want the best for her, why would she want to go anywhere else? And something landed for me at that moment. So I think it's about being able to stand in those spaces and ask ourselves those questions about why are we doing it like we're doing it, and can we really ask ourselves the question about how would this feel if this were me or if it was somebody I loved, and not just simply skim to the answer, yeah, it would be fine. Because if I don't fundamentally believe it could be me or somebody I love, then that's a different answer, and it means that I'm othering. I'm thinking about us and them as something different.
I think there's great opportunity here because this doesn't require a policy, this doesn't require permission, this doesn't require funding. This requires us to consider everything we do. And, quite often with organisations that I start a relationship with, we go through a walkthrough through their programs, and I ask them to start to be attentive to every part of their service that may be in the othering space. The glass walls, the staff toilets versus, people who aren't staff toilets, and go, what is that saying? The kind of demarcated spaces. And it's amazing when you start to look at stuff. It's screaming at you everywhere. And what are you prepared to do? And I was with a service in Kansas recently, and they were walking through as a team, and they're just going, then there's that, and there's that, and there's that. And we got to the dining room. So this is a homeless service, and there was plastic knives and forks and plastic plates. And I said, what's this about? And they said, well, we can't give them real china because they might do something with it, so we only give them plastic knives and forks. And I said, so there's a whole kind of few hours of conversation on that one. But then they trotted out the china plates for themselves. And I said, what's easy to do right here and now? What would be easy to do? and they said, we'd love to give away, throw all the paper plates and knives and forks, plastic knives and forks in the bin and offer the china plates, but we're scared. I said, that's the heart of it, is to coming back to having those conversations. So the subtleness of the othering is there all around us, and our eyes, when we open our eyes, we'll see it and we'll go, oh, wow, what are we prepared to do differently here?
Can I come to it briefly as a sort of personnel management issue? It's fundamental. I mean, if you say that something like a person is the expert in their lives and they're your equal, then it is really easy to spot in a minute in an individual situation or a group situation if that's the way people are behaving towards their clients. You can see it immediately. We all see it, and what we do is we don't speak up about it. We do not confront it in our own teams. I see it every day when I'm wandering around my own member organisations. I sit in groups where allegedly it's all being run by the clients while I watch the staff gradually disempower them in every way you could think of with the sweetest smile on their face. We've got to call that stuff every time. It's really easy to spot. It's really easy to spot when somebody doesn't think the person in front of them really is the expert on their own life.
Sorry, Andrew, can I just say I was going to, as pre-rehearsed, throw my papers down in a fit of rage, in a peak of rage, and storm off the stage in order to make my 12 o'clock taxi to get me to the airport at 1:05 for my flight. But we've agreed on too many things. I've really enjoyed the conversation and have appreciated the opportunity to listen and learn as well as to share a few thoughts. But I do have to make a bit of a dash for it, so my apologies. And I just encourage people to perhaps take any opportunity that they might have, and they might all be different opportunities, but to take any opportunity that they might have to progress the cause of mental health reform with some sort of concrete action over the next little while, because I think, as David said, now's the time. We're at a really critical time, and those actions will be well received.
And thank you very much, Frank, for your contribution. Those people who are appointed to throw palm fronds on the carpet in front of him as he walks out, could you do that now? It just reminded me of a conversation we were having last night about the appointment and booking systems that I suspect your agency's the same as ours. How disrespectful are they of the people that we want to meet with? We have spent tens of thousands on software and books and people's workloads to get other people to fit into our needs, and we politely tell them when they can come and when they can't. One agency, you have to wait 3 weeks to get to see a person, and they say, well, we're not a crisis agency. Oh, yes you are. People do come to you because they need you, whether their lives are falling apart right at that moment or not. But I think there are a lot of challenges in all of our systems, the way that we work. The next question for you, David, it would have been for Frank, but he's nicked off. So what did you mean by the third paragraph in your speech? Oh, no, sorry. No, the next question is, how would NDIA envisage to build capacity if they were to swallow PIR? How would they still do capacity building if they incorporated PIR?
Frank and I were talking about this at the break. From July the 1st, 2016, the Partners in Recovery money belongs to the NDIA. That doesn't mean that they'll necessarily waste it. They might use it brilliantly for some of the purposes that I was trying to talk about this morning. I think that there's a bright future there, both as a gateway for the NDIS and as a provider of services of coordination and long-term intensive personal support, as I talked about before, and maybe some other things too about system change stuff. How do we guarantee that? I think I've already answered it in my talk. Perhaps we'll hear some other spin on it from other people, but I think I already trotted out my best shot at that one, Andrew.
Thank you. I've got one here that's about the State Department, but none of you are familiar with the State Department, so I might think of another way to word that. I wouldn't like to put them on the spot. It might be a bit unfair asking them to speak on behalf of the state government. How is it determined what the dollar figure is for a NDIS recipient? David, I think that's yours.
Well, they're working on an average across Australia of $35,000 to $37,000 a year. That's really retrospective logic, or what's the word? They're retrofitting, making it look like it was what they intended all along, but it's really the way it's just averaging out. I find it difficult to know how to think about what's right in this area. I know from the HASI program and the IFPRIS program and the HAS program, every state's got a different name for its mental health intensive support programs. Take HASI in New South Wales, for example. There have been a handful of people there who've been getting $100,000 a year for a whole range of supports, but that's included the cost of clinical services. So I've never seen it properly deconstructed to work out NDS-like supports, how much would they have cost in that package. I think that nobody knows, actually. In the Hunter, where a few hundred people have got packages now, they've mainly been people who have been long-term clients of the mental health services. Some of them have been in hospital for decades. They're averaging around about $40,000. I think more important is that we continue the discussion about what are relevant sorts of support that come at the end of a well-done process of identifying with somebody what's going to take for them to get to a good life. I saw 2 examples in the last few weeks, I'll do this as quickly as I can, of people who were responding to a person who had big hoarding and squalor issues. One was in an NDIA trial site and one wasn't. The one in the NDIA trial site was the NDIA people worked with the person who came in themselves, self-referred, talked things through about herself and her child, and ended up with a package of $66,000 a year for the next year at least, to be reviewed then, of a whole variety of personal support, cleaning and respite and companionship and shopping and respite care and transport, a whole variety of very disability-looking services. They then went looking for a provider, and all the mental health providers in this area have looked at it and said, no, we don't want to do that, because no one's engaged with the person in any meaningful way about what the issues are. At the moment, as far as I know, that's a motherless $66,000 looking for a provider. Another one I saw was where a PIR worker was working with a person with very similar issues. This guy spent 5 months getting in the front door, down the hallway and into the kitchen, and eventually sharing a meal with the PIR worker. At the end of it, they come up with a set of arrangements involving the local council and some negotiations with Centre Care and something else that eludes me at the moment, which is going to cost nothing. And the person is saying that, their life has started again. And the worker finished by saying he reckons he's about 10 centimetres taller than when he first met him. So that may be oversimplifying things, but that process of getting to know people and working through what it is will make the life that they want is much more important in my mind than arguing at the moment about what's the right price of a package.
I think there's, when I listen to what you're saying, David, I think there's a really important point that we've got to hold really tightly here, is that a service should never, ever be the first response to a human need. And if we plug and play people straight into a service without considering what's naturally occurring, where would everyone else get this need met first, the risk is we'll leave with institutionalisation. And I dare say your second example here is about how to, very kind of thoughtful PIR support facilitator thinking outside the square to think about what else is out there before just going service, 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 service.
Next question relates to consumer participation and feedback, which are phrases that we've been using for a long time. What will it look like next? Consumer participation and feedback. Helen.
Consumer participation is something that 25, 30 years ago was the bread and butter of the peer movement in this country, but I think we've had to stretch beyond that now, and many people are still seeing it as the centrepiece. The work is consumer participation, if we frame it as we have always framed it, it actually supports us into our stuckness because it asks us to participate through our illness identity in life. I think the stretch in this is about thinking about where does it land, and many of the times we're asking people. There's a principle that many services that are thinking outside of this are stretching to, and they say we support people to live, love, work and play in their own life and resist the urge to invite them to live, work, love and play in our services. And I think this is the challenge, is how do we think about connection and belonging beyond participation as a consumer in a service ideology. The feedback mechanism, I'm not sure what the question's referring to here, but it's about how do we see people as partners and how do we see ourselves as in this relationship as a partnership as opposed to someone that we just give feedback to. So some of the work out there that's being really strong, and I refer you to Scott Miller's work around this, is around how do we check for engagement with people? How are we doing together? Is what you've come here to get good at, is that working? Is there the things that I'm creating as an opportunity here, is that something that's useful for you? We know some things about engagement, and we're not talking this language about how can we create opportunities for us to engage together as opposed to how can I get you to participate in my service?
The whole business of, how is the question exactly phrased? How will it look in a few years' time?
Yeah. How does consumer participation and feedback look? What does it look like? I didn't read it strictly like it was.
Well, it's going to be multicoloured. There'll be every sort of strategy going on. We continue to muddle through with, consumer advisory groups and so on at the policy level. I guess I feel quite dissatisfied with a lot of that. I see it as token quite a lot of the time, and as Frank said, dressing on a salad that's already been designed. But you've got to keep trying a whole variety of strategies. I've just been involved in what I think is quite an innovative strategy where we've done some workshops around Australia recently with about 120 people, which has been designed to directly teach people how to go to a politician and tell them what they want. And these have all been people who are either carers or people with a severe mental illness. About 80 of the people had a severe mental illness. And I did it jointly with a guy from the States, from NAMI in the States, the National Alliance for Mental Illness. And those workshops have gone well. Already about 15 politicians have been directly approached. We spent a few hours there identifying what the message would be so that every politician gets the same message at the same time. And it's the one that I've been going on about today. What they decided they wanted to do as groups was to say, act now on mental illness, commit to implementing the framework of the National Mental Health Commission. No more reports until you start that. That's what they decided their message was. And quite a few of them have already started making those appointments. There was a guy in Adelaide who said, I've just worked out that my local member is Christopher Pine, and I don't like him. That's probably true for about 75% of Australians, I think, because he can be an irritating guy, but he's a very powerful member of the current government and a very smart dude. He said, I don't know what I'm going to talk to him about. And he said, tell me something about him. And I said, well, he's been, he's a very strong acolyte of John Howard's for a long time. And he said, didn't John Howard introduce the FAMS programs and better access and all that? I said, yes, he did. He said, I've got it. I'm going to tell him that John Howard's masterpiece in mental health from 7 or 8 years ago is being undone by the current government, and what's he going to do about it? Well, straight to the masterclass as far as I was concerned. And that sort of advocacy is going on as we speak. There are some people who, for a variety of reasons, their own fears of failure in the situation, realistically saying, let's go as a group. And so when we had people who identified that, we worked with them on what each person's role would be if they went as a group, so they weren't just all talking at once. We talk through with people how to use your lived experience in a way that gives authenticity to the meeting with the politician but doesn't overwhelm them with your entire history, etc., etc. So that's just one of, I hope, 100 flowers blooming in the area of consumer participation.
I think this is the whole concept of feedback is a really interesting one and a powerful one, I think, around culture change. We know from organisational behaviour and change processes outside of our sector about what engages a workforce to be healthy, what engages a productive workforce. And one of the key levers of that is having strong feedback mechanisms. When I work with organisations, I say, how do you get your feedback? How do you know what you're doing is useful? How do you hear that on a daily mantra? And frankly, people don't. So therefore, that workers, if they're not able to access daily feedback about is our work that we've done together today useful, work productivity, absenteeism increases, presenteeism increases, leaving the workforce increases because we're missing feedback loops. So I was asking an organisation, they were working in learning circles, and I said, this month, I'd like you to go out and ask 2 people that you're providing services for ask them for some feedback around how are they, how is the support that you're providing landing with them, get curious with them about how they kind of experience it. And at first, the workers were very anxious about that because that meant risking and risking kind of not hearing, this fear about what happens if they say they don't. It also meant leaning into their vulnerability more about asking, can you give me some feedback about me instead of me giving you feedback about you? The outcome of that for the energy for the staff in this organisation was, wow, we never knew how people understood us, how they experienced this, because we've never asked. And this doesn't, again, require a policy. This doesn't require resources, but it does require an invitation and support to stretch into that. When we get the feedback about, we then adjust ourselves. Okay, I can do more of this, less of that. We increase the opportunities of developing a partnership, and we increase the opportunities of people not disengaging from the things that they want to have help with. This knowledge base doesn't come from our sector. It comes from business world. It comes from those that do engagement spectacularly well. And so we need to also stretch into new knowledges outside of our own in order to change our old ways of participation that are no longer serving us.
Yeah, I agree. And there was a time in the UK actually when Helen was over, and I drive a lot in the UK because we can't fly because it's too little. You spend more time in the airport than you do in the air. So we drive everywhere in the UK. And I was following a lorry that said, "How's my driving?" on the back bumper. How's my driving? Call this number, tell me how my driving is. And we started having a conversation about, well, actually, what would it be like if we wore, you call them buttons, we call them badges, saying, I'm here to support your self-mastery. How am I doing? And actually, I mean, it was, we
did have red wine when we were thinking about this little initiative.
We may have had red wine when we were talking about this. And yet there is there's a serious point here, isn't there, about how open are we to that feedback? How much do we invite that feedback? And the more we invite it, perhaps the more familiar we get with it. Perhaps I think I'm probably...
we had buttons like, you can recover, ask me how.
Yeah, yeah. So this idea that actually I think practitioners are often fearful. But, hey, what does that say? If I'm fearful that I occupy a space that doesn't actually deliver, what am I doing occupying that space?
I don't believe in what I'm doing. If I don't get the feedback to say, hey, I'm doing a really good job here, then I disengage.
Yeah. So imagine what your button would say if you could frame what your version of putting the man on the moon is, whether that's I'm here to support your self-mastery, I'm here to get out of your way, whatever that is, what would your button say? And how would you invite people to say, how am I doing?
I'm afraid the last one's for you.
How are we doing? How we doing is also, it's not just up to me doing, it's how are we doing in this work together. And this, you know, I think this is where we can start to do the everyday things. Like that could happen tomorrow in all our lives, around us daring to lean into that and ask that question.
The last question's for you, David. Where is the funding come from to help the other 80%?
Well, in the words of senior people in the NDIA, some other source. I think I went through this before as fully as I can. The first thing to do is don't give any away. So if you're community services or disability or welfare or whatever other organisation by any name is thinking of giving away money to the NDIS scheme, stop. If your health system is thinking of giving away money to the NDIS scheme, stop. And that is not a reflection on the scheme itself, it's just a reflection on how the idiocy of assuming that it's going to take over your current functions. So that's the first thing, protect the current war chest. From there on in, one of the key reasons we need to get sign-on to that National Mental Health Commission report is that hidden in there are a few very important assumptions, like the fact that 40% of people get nothing at the moment in the severe mental illness area, and that we ought to commit over 10 years to be fixing that. We need to embed a commitment to some sort of progress. At the moment, nobody knows the answer to the question of where more money will come from. At the moment in Canberra, and in most states and territories, all conversations are whiteboard discussions by razor gangs looking for ways to save money. By about November this year, there will be a large list which is starting to get set in stone of things that are going to get cut next year. Keep off those boards is my next thing. You know, we start with a huge, I know this is sounding very general, Andrew, but it is a very general political problem at the moment. As I was saying before, almost a perfect storm if we're not careful. We have to convert the public sympathy in Australia into this being a political, holy, what's the word I'm looking for? Something they're not allowed to touch. What's the word for that? It's not the Holy Grail. Sacred cow, that was the word I was saying. We've got to turn it into a sacred cow. Australia, one of the interesting surveys that gets done in the world is on people's prioritising of issues that will determine their vote at the next election. Australia is way ahead of the next country on the number of people who say that mental health will be one of the top 3 issues that will decide their vote at the next election. 35% of Australians, as opposed to 15% of people in England and 10% of people in the United States, say that mental health is one of the things that will decide their vote at the next election. There's a lot of goodwill out there. You know, organisations like Beyond Blue and others have done fantastic things. I was on a plane the other day. Oh, God, here we go again.
You won't sit next to Helen, will you?
A plane the other day, and I was having this conversation with a woman next to me who, after I finished describing what I do, said, "Oh, serious mental illness, that must be dreadful. God, I'd hate it." She said, "My brother suicided. He was very depressed, and I have bipolar, but imagine having to deal with severe mental illness. That would be awful." And I thought, bloody hell, we've only got schizophrenia to go, you know, in terms of the dinner party conversations when you can talk about mental health issues. That's fantastic progress. And it's being reflected in those surveys. We've got to turn that into it being a political sacred cow. You cannot mess with the services that we've currently got, and you've got to get some more going soon.
Can I ask you to thank the panel? They've been terrific. And when it comes to money, you don't have to worry about the money. I think in the last 15 months, what did we commit? 32 billion to aircraft, another X billion to submarines, and another X billion to air frigates. Well, I don't think I'll be requiring any of those, but I might require a mental health service very soon. Can I just thank the panel? They've all made terrific contributions now and in their individual presentations. Thank you very much for high quality input.